The flames devoured the paper with hungry intensity. Each corner curled into ash as Catherine Morgan watched the debt contract that had claimed to own her soul disappear forever. The orange glow illuminated Elijah Stone's weathered face as he held the burning document. His calloused fingers remained steady despite the heat licking dangerously close to his skin. Around them, the Denver wind carried away the last remnants of legal bondage. The crowd outside the courthouse stood transfixed. Some watched in horror at the brazen destruction of official documents. Others recognized the symbolism, the poetry of fire, consuming lies written on expensive paper with forged signatures and stolen authority. These men claimed they owned you, Elijah said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and 8 years of solitude. The words cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade through winter air. Catherine stepped closer, placing her hand over his on the burning papers. Together they held the flames, held the moment, held the future they had fought so desperately to claim. But they never did, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The heat seared close to their joined hands, but neither pulled away. Some truths demanded sacrifice, even small ones, like wrist burns and public spectacle. Elijah's pale blue eyes met hers with an intensity that still quickened her heartbeat after all these months. You owe nothing now, not to Morrison, not to fear, not to anyone but yourself. And to you, Catherine whispered. No. His voice carried absolute conviction. Not even to me. You're free, Catherine. Finally, completely free. The final fragment crumbled into ash. The mountain wind, somehow finding its way into the city streets, scattered those ashes across cobblestones and carried them toward the peaks that had become their sanctuary. Jake Morrison, shackled between two federal marshals, screamed curses that no one bothered to hear. His face still marked by the scars Catherine's fingernails had carved 6 months ago, contorted with impotent rage. But the path to this moment of liberation had been carved through suffering, through blood, through a winter so harsh it had nearly claimed both their lives. The story began not with fire, but with violence of a different kind, in a place meant to be sacred during an hour meant for prayer. 6 months earlier, September 1867, the mountains had just begun their autumn transformation. The raid, the chapel of St. Mary's Convent, sat nestled in the foothills of the Colorado Territory like a pearl in weathered hands. Evening light streamed through simple windows, casting golden bars across the wooden pews, where 8 women knelt in prayer. Their voices rose in unison, weaving the ancient words of Vespers into something approaching beauty, despite their lack of formal musical training. Sister Catherine Morgan's lips moved with the familiar Latin, but her mind wandered to the writer's Mother Superior Abigail had mentioned during afternoon chores. 3 men, rough-looking, asking questions about the convent in the trading post 5 miles down the mountain road. Trappers and traders passed through regularly, but something in Mother Superior's expression had suggested these were different, dangerous. Catherine had served here for 5 years since taking her vows at 19. Long enough to recognize the subtle signs of the older woman's concern. The slight tightness around Mother Superior's mouth, the way her fingers worried at her rosary beads with unusual intensity, the instruction for all sisters to remain inside the compound after dark. But the evening prayers proceeded as always. Sister Ruth, Catherine's closest friend among the community, knelt 2 places down the pew. The younger novices, barely past 17, occupied the front row, with the earnest devotion of new commitment. The candlelight flickered peacefully. The mountain air carried the scent of pine through open windows. Everything appeared as it should be in a house dedicated to God's service. Then the door exploded inward. The crash of splintering wood shattered the sacred quiet. The ancient hymn died on 8 pairs of lips as 6 armed men poured into the chapel like wolves into a sheepfold. Their boots thundered on the wooden floor. Their weapons caught the candlelight with ugly promise. And at their center stood a man whose refined appearance made him somehow more terrifying than his crude companions. Jake Morrison wore a tailored coat despite the mountain setting. His dark hair lay slicked back with expensive pomade. His smile revealed teeth too white, too perfect, too predatory. He surveyed the kneeling women with the casual interest of a man inspecting livestock at auction. "Good evening, sisters." His voice carried the smooth tones of education and the cold calculation of a mind that viewed human beings as commodities. "We're here to collect what's owed, the young ones specifically." Mother Superior Abigail rose to her feet with the dignity of 6 decades serving the church. her face normally kind transformed into something carved from stone. "This is a house of God. You have no business here. Leave at once." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "God doesn't pay debts, sister, and your convent owes a considerable sum to certain business interests I represent. Since the church seems unable to settle its accounts in currency, we'll accept payment in kind." He gestured to his men. "The four youngest. Load them up." What happened next would replay in Catherine's nightmares for months afterward. Mother Superior moved to block the aisle, her small frame suddenly imposing despite her age. Morrison didn't hesitate. His fist struck her temple with brutal efficiency. The sound of knuckles meeting bone echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. Mother Superior crumpled, blood streaming from a wound above her eye. Sister Ruth screamed. The novices tried to run. Morrison's men moved with practiced coordination, cutting off escape routes and hurting their targets with rough efficiency. These were not random bandits. They were professionals executing a plan. Catherine felt something ancient and primal surge through her body. Not the meek acceptance her vows supposedly demanded, but raw fury. Her hand closed around a brass candlestick. 10 pounds of solid metal became an extension of her rage. She swung with all her strength at the nearest man. The candlestick connected with his shoulder, drawing a howl of pain. Before she could strike again, Morrison appeared beside her. His hand caught her wrist with crushing force. The candlestick clattered to the floor. "This one has spirit." Morrison observed his face inches from hers. Catherine could smell the whiskey on his breath, the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask something rotten underneath. "She'll fetch a premium price. Educated women always do, especially when they come with that religious mystique." Catherine clawed at his face with her free hand. Her fingernails raked across his left cheek, carving 4 parallel furrows that welled with blood. Morrison's expression never changed, but his grip on her wrist tightened until bones ground together. Catherine gasped with pain, but refused to cry out. "Try that again," Morrison said conversationally, "and I'll make sure Ruth pays the price, personally. Do you understand what I mean, Sister Catherine?" Catherine understood. The threat in his voice carried absolute certainty. She went still. Within minutes, Morrison's men had loaded 4 women into a covered wagon like cargo. Catherine, Ruth, and the 2 teenage novices found themselves bound and gagged, their habits torn and dirtied. Through a gap in the wagon's canvas cover, Catherine caught a final glimpse of Mother Superior lying motionless in a spreading pool of blood on the chapel floor. The rosary beads were ripped from Catherine's fingers. The symbol of her commitment to spiritual service became just another piece of discarded property. The wagon lurched into motion, carrying them away from the only refuge Catherine had known for 5 years, away from the illusion of safety, away from everything she had believed about how the world worked. The journey into nightmare lasted 3 days. They traveled northwest, climbing higher into the mountains with each passing hour. The men rotated guard duty, ensuring none of their captives could attempt escape. On the rare occasions when the wagon stopped, Catherine caught fragments of conversation that painted a horrifying picture of their fate. "Mining camps pay top dollar for women," one guard remarked while checking the horses, "especially the young pretty ones. Months without seeing a female does things to men, makes them desperate, generous." "What about the older one?" another asked. "The one who fought Morrison." "Saloons can always use an educated woman. Someone who can read, do figures, keep the books. Plus, breaking in a nun is a fantasy for certain clientele. She'll earn her keep." Catherine lay in the darkness of the wagon, processing the casual way these men discuss selling human beings. Her entire understanding of morality, of law, of civilization crumbled with each passing mile. She had believed the world operated under God's justice, that evil would be punished and good rewarded. That belief died somewhere on the mountain trail between St. Mary's Convent and whatever hell awaited them at journey's end. On the second night Catherine attempted escape, she had worked her bonds partially loose over hours of patient effort. When the guard dozed near the campfire, she slipped from the wagon and ran into the darkness of the forest. She made it perhaps 200 yards before they caught her. The beating that followed was methodical, designed to punish without permanently damaging valuable merchandise. Ribs cracked, flesh bruised purple and black. Blood flowed from split skin. Morrison personally delivered the final lesson. He dragged Ruth from the wagon and forced Catherine to watch as he struck her friend across the face. Once, twice, 3 times. Each blow deliberate, each impact precise. "Every time you try to escape, Morrison explained with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow student. Ruth suffers every single time. Do we understand each other now, Sister Catherine? Catherine understood. The monster before her had reduced morality to its most brutal equation, obedience or punishment, compliance or watching someone she loved destroyed piece by piece. She stopped trying to escape. By the third day, hypothermia had joined pain and despair as Catherine's constant companions. The mountain nights dropped below freezing. The thin habits provided no protection against temperatures that could kill in hours. Catherine's fingers turned blue. Her teeth chattered so violently she feared they would crack. Through the wagon's canvas opening, she watched the wilderness grow more forbidding with each mile. Towering pines blocked out most of the sky. The air grew thin and sharp. The civilized world she had known seemed to exist only in memory. These mountains operated under different laws. Here survival mattered more than social convention. Strength trumped justice. And men like Morrison thrived in places where no one would hear screams or answer pleas for mercy. On the dawn of the fourth day, the wagon stopped in a clearing. The first gunshot shattered the early morning quiet like the crack of divine judgment. Catherine, barely conscious from the beating and cold, jerked alert at the sound. Through her pain-fogged awareness, she heard Morrison's men shouting in confusion. A second shot rang out before they could organize a response. Someone screamed. The sound of a body hitting the ground carried a terrible finality. The wagon lurched as the horses panicked. Catherine tried to see through the canvas opening, but her swollen eyes could barely focus. She heard more gunfire, not the wild spraying of frightened men, but single precise shots delivered with calm professionalism. Each crack of the rifle announced another of Morrison's gang falling. Then silence descended, absolute and total. Even the birds had stopped singing. Catherine held her breath, waiting. Footsteps approached the wagon. Slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who knew violence intimately and walked through its aftermath without fear. The canvas flap drew back. A man stood silhouetted against the dawn light, tall, perhaps 6'2", broad shoulders under a buckskin jacket, dark hair hanging past his collar, a beard that spoke of months without proper grooming, and eyes the color of winter ice that swept across the wagon's interior with tactical precision, cataloging everything in seconds. His hands held a Sharps rifle with the easy familiarity of someone for whom the weapon had become an extension of his body. Catherine noticed details through her haze of pain. The rifle was spotless despite obvious age and use. His fingers rested lightly on the stock, ready, but not tense. Blood spattered his jacket sleeve, but his expression remained calm, almost peaceful. "Sister Bum," the man said, his voice gravelly from disuse. "Can you hear me?" Catherine tried to answer, but managed only a weak nod. The man's gaze moved to Ruth and the novices, assessing their condition with what looked like practiced medical evaluation. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Morrison," he called without looking away from the women. "Let's discuss terms." Jake Morrison's voice came from somewhere beyond Catherine's limited field of vision. "Terms? You just killed 3 of my men, you mountain savage. The only terms are you dying slowly." "I count 6 of you total when you entered this clearing," the stranger replied conversationally. "I've dropped 2 so far. The third is bleeding out by the fire, probably dead in 5 minutes. That leaves you and 2 others. I reload faster than you think, and I haven't missed a shot in 8 years. So let's try again. Terms." The cold mathematical precision in his voice suggested this was not bravado. This was a man stating facts about his capabilities the same way someone might discuss the weather. "What terms?" Morrison asked, and Catherine heard the first crack in his confidence. "Release the women. Ride out of here. You live. Simple." Morrison laughed, but the sound carried a hollow edge. "These women are worth $2,000. I'm not leaving money. You're leaving vertical or horizontal. Choose." A pause. Catherine could imagine Morrison calculating odds, weighing his professional reputation against survival instinct. She heard Morrison's boots on the ground moving toward the wagon. His hand grabbed her hair, yanking her toward the canvas opening. Pain exploded through Catherine's skull, but she bit back any sound that might give him satisfaction. "How about this stone?" Morrison shouted. "I know who you are, the ghost of Pine Ridge, famous for the 3 bandits you killed in '65. Well, I've got a hostage. You take a shot at me, she dies too. 50-50 odds on your precious rescue." The stranger's pale blue eyes met Catherine's for a fraction of a second. She saw calculation there, assessment, the same tactical evaluation he had given the clearing and the rifles and the tactical situation. Then his expression shifted into something that made her breath catch despite everything. Not anger, not fear, just absolute implacable resolve. "I don't miss," the stranger said quietly. "Not in 8 years, not today. Release her." Morrison's hand tightened in Catherine's hair. "You're bluffing. No one's that good. I walked to my horse with this one. You let me ride out. Then maybe I leave her alive down the trail." "Last chance." Morrison started to drag Catherine from the wagon. She felt his body tense, preparing to use her as a shield. The stranger's rifle moved so slightly Catherine almost missed it. The adjustment could not have been more than an inch. A tiny compensation for wind distance, the precise geometry of 3 people in lethal alignment. The shot when it came sounded different from the others, sharper, more focused. Catherine felt Morrison's grip vanish, as if God himself had severed the connection. The trafficker stumbled backward, a hole opening in his right shoulder exactly where it joined his arm. Non-lethal, but utterly disabling. His gun clattered to the ground. Morrison stared at his shattered shoulder with the dawning comprehension of someone who had just encountered a force beyond his understanding. "I said I don't miss." The stranger's rifle was already reloading, the practiced motion taking perhaps 2 seconds. "And I said release her. Didn't say I'd make it painless if you refused. Your friends have about 10 seconds to get you on a horse before I decide I'm done being merciful. Anyone still here after that gets the next bullet somewhere more permanent." Morrison's remaining men grabbed their boss and ran. Catherine heard horses thundering away through the forest. The sound faded, leaving only morning bird song and the ragged gasping of someone trying not to sob with relief. The stranger approached the wagon slowly, carefully, keeping his hands visible. Up close, Catherine could see more details. The buckskin jacket had been professionally made, but had seen hard use. His beard was neat despite its length, maintained with military precision. Scars marked his hands, the kind that came from hard work and harder living. But his eyes, those winter-pale eyes, showed something unexpected. Concern. Genuine, unfeigned concern. "Sister Ruth," he addressed the other conscious woman, "can you help the young ones? I need to tend to Sister Catherine's injuries first. She's hypothermic and has at least 2 broken ribs from what I can see." Ruth nodded mutely, still processing their sudden salvation. The stranger produced a knife. Catherine flinched despite herself. He noticed, and his movements became even more deliberate as he cut her bonds. "I'm Elijah Stone. I have medical training from the war. I'm going to check your injuries. I'll tell you everything before I do it." "All right," Catherine managed another nod. Elijah's hands moved over her with professional detachment, cataloging damage with the efficiency of someone who had treated battlefield trauma. His touch remained gentle, despite the clinical nature of the examination. When his fingers probed her ribs, Catherine gasped. 2 broken, possibly 3, Elijah confirmed. "Hypothermia setting in, severe bruising across most of your torso, lacerations on your wrists from the bonds. You'll live, but you need warmth and proper care. How far is the nearest settlement?" 40 miles, Ruth answered when Catherine couldn't. "Back the way we came. The missionary station at Timber Creek." Elijah's jaw tightened again. Catherine was beginning to recognize that tiny movement as his equivalent of someone else cursing violently. He looked at the 4 women, calculating distances and survival odds with the same precision he had applied to the gunfight. "My cabin is 8 miles up the mountain," he said finally. "Sister Catherine can't travel 40 miles in her condition. I'll take her there first, get her stable. Then I'll come back for the rest of you tomorrow with supplies and a stronger horse." He looked at Ruth directly. "Can you handle a rifle?" Ruth, daughter of a Kansas farmer who had learned to shoot before she learned to read, nodded. Elijah handed her his sharps and a pouch of cartridges. "Anyone comes back before I return, you shoot first and pray for their souls later." "Understand?" "Yes." Without further discussion, Elijah lifted Catherine from the wagon. She was not a small woman, but he carried her as if her weight barely registered. As they left the clearing, Catherine's consciousness began to fade. The combination of injuries, cold, and shock pulled her toward darkness. Her last clear memory of those moments was Elijah's voice, quiet and steady as the mountains themselves. Sleep if you need to. I've got you. You're safe now. Safe. The word seemed impossible after 3 days in hell, but something in Elijah Stone's tone made Catherine believe it. She surrendered to unconsciousness with the strange certainty that this terrifying man who had just killed her captors might be the most trustworthy person she had ever met. The sanctuary, Catherine's awareness returned in fragments. The sensation of warmth first. Real warmth, not the feverish heat of hypothermia, but the solid comfort of a well-maintained fire. Then the softness of an actual mattress beneath her body instead of wagon boards. The weight of quilts piled carefully across her frame. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking. She opened her eyes to find herself in a small cabin room. The log walls had been expertly chinked against drafts. A stone fireplace radiated heat from one corner. Weak sunlight filtered through a window, covered with oiled paper rather than expensive glass. The furnishings were sparse but well made. A handmade chair, a small table, a trunk against one wall. Everything spoke of someone who valued function over decoration but took pride in craftsmanship. Catherine realized she was wearing a clean nightgown. Not her habit. The garment was simple cotton, slightly too large for her frame. A blanket hung from the ceiling, creating a partition between her sleeping area and the rest of the cabin. Privacy maintained even in close quarters. She tried to sit up. Pain exploded through her ribs, forcing a gasp. Immediately, footsteps approached from beyond the blanket partition. "Don't move." Elijah's voice carried absolute command. "Your ribs are wrapped, but any sudden motion could shift them. Just call if you need something." "Where?" Catherine's voice came out as a croak. A cup appeared around the edge of the blanket, held by a hand that carefully avoided looking past the partition. Water cold and pure. Catherine drank gratefully. "My cabin," Elijah answered her unfinished question. "8 miles up the mountain from where I found you. You've been unconscious for about 18 hours. The hypothermia was worse than I initially thought. I had to use some aggressive rewarming techniques, but your color is better now. The fever broke around dawn." Catherine processed this. 18 hours, aggressive rewarming, the nightgown that was not hers. But Elijah's tone remained purely clinical, and the careful way he avoided visual contact suggested he had maintained propriety even while saving her life. "Ruth," Catherine managed. "The others." "I rode back at first light, brought them to the missionary station 30 miles south. Family named Patterson, good people. They're caring for your sisters. Ruth asked me to tell you she's praying for your recovery." Relief flooded through Catherine. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You're going to be here for a while. Can't travel in your condition. Maybe 2 weeks before you're strong enough for the journey to the Patterson place. Hope you don't mind isolation." "How long have you lived here?" Catherine asked, needing to understand the man who had become her unexpected savior. A pause. 8 years, since the war ended. "Alone?" "Yes." The single word carried volumes. Catherine wanted to ask more, but exhaustion pulled at her. Her eyes drifted closed despite her desire to stay alert. "Sleep," Elijah said from beyond the partition. "Your body needs rest to heal. I'll wake you for food in a few hours." Over the following days, Catherine observed her rescuer through the limited lens of her convalescence. Elijah maintained careful distance, communicating mainly through brief, practical exchanges. He brought meals at regular intervals. Simple food, but well prepared. Venison stew, cornbread, tea brewed from mountain herbs. He changed the bandages on her wrists with professional detachment, his hands gentle, but impersonal. He slept somewhere beyond the partition, though Catherine never heard him. He moved through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of someone long accustomed to solitude. Before dawn, she would wake to find him already gone out hunting or tending to whatever work sustained his isolated existence. He would return as the sun set, carrying firewood or fresh meat or water from a nearby stream. Catherine found herself fascinated by the small details of his life. The worn Bible on the mantel, its pages soft with reading. The carefully maintained rifle that clearly represented his primary tool for survival. The handful of books in the trunk, unexpected in such a remote location. Medical texts, poetry, a volume of Shakespeare's plays. One evening, about a week into her recovery, Catherine broke their pattern of minimal conversation. "You said you had medical training from the war, Union or Confederate." Elijah paused in his work of cleaning the rifle. A long silence stretched before he answered. Union, Vermont Regiment. Enlisted in 61, mustered out in 64 after Gettysburg. Infantry, sharpshooter. Another pause. 43 confirmed kills over 3 years. That's what the Army recorded officially. The actual number was higher. Catherine heard no pride in the statement. Just fact delivered with the same clinical detachment he used discussing her injuries. But underneath the neutral tone, she detected something else. Weariness. The soul-deep exhaustion of someone who had seen and done things that could never be forgotten or fully forgiven. I'm sorry, Catherine said quietly. For what? That you had to become someone who knows how to kill. Elijah set down the rifle cleaning rod. Through the partition, Catherine couldn't see his expression, but his voice when he spoke carried a rough edge. I'm not sorry. Morrison and his men were trafficking women. Probably done it dozens of times before. They would have sold you to men who would have destroyed what was left of your soul after they finished with your body. If my ability to kill saved you from that, then every death I carry was worth it. The fierce conviction in his words sent a strange shiver through Catherine. Not fear, something else she couldn't quite name. How did you know to be there in that clearing? I didn't know. I was tracking. Deer heard the wagon. Morrison's operation wasn't subtle. I followed for a few hours, saw how they treated you through the trees, made my decision. To risk your life for strangers. To stop bad men from doing bad things. Same reason I joined the war. Some choices don't require long contemplation. Catherine absorbed this. The man who had saved her lived by a moral code so absolute it transcended personal risk. He killed without hesitation when protecting innocence, but carried those deaths as burdens rather than badges of honor. He maintained her dignity while caring for her injuries with a combination of skill and respect she had never encountered. He was perhaps the most dangerous and most honorable person she had ever met. As her physical strength returned, Catherine began to contribute to the cabin's daily needs. She could cook despite her limited mobility. She could mend Elijah's worn clothes. She could tend the fire and maintain the living space. The work felt different from her convent duties. More immediate, more essential to survival rather than spiritual discipline. Elijah accepted her help without comment, but Catherine noticed small changes. He spoke more, explaining the work that needed doing and teaching her skills she would need if she remained in the mountains. How to read the weather signs in the clouds. How to preserve meat through smoking and salting. How to recognize the difference between animal tracks and understand what they meant. Why teach me this? Catherine asked one evening, as Elijah demonstrated how to maintain the fire through the night. I'll be leaving for the mission soon. Elijah's hands paused in their work of arranging logs. Maybe, but maybe the journey gets delayed by weather. Maybe you end up somewhere else remote. Knowledge of survival hurts no one and can save anyone. But Catherine suspected the real reason lay deeper. Elijah was lonely. 8 years alone on a mountain left marks on his soul. Teaching her was connection, however brief and formal. A reminder that he remained capable of human interaction beyond violence and isolation. The first snow came in mid-October, earlier than usual, according to Elijah's terse assessment. Catherine stood at the window watching fat flakes drift through the pines and felt the first stirrings of concern. Travel in snow would be difficult, dangerous for someone still recovering from broken ribs and hypothermia. How bad will winter be? She asked. Elijah studied the sky with the intensity of someone reading a sacred text. Bad. We might get trapped up here until spring, 3, maybe 4 months before the trails are passable again. Trapped, Catherine's heart began to race. I can't stay here that long. It wouldn't be proper. Proper doesn't enter into it. Weather decides who lives and dies in these mountains. You try to travel in what's coming, you'll freeze to death within 2 days. So will anyone trying to fetch you. The reality of her situation crystallized with terrible clarity. She would spend winter isolated in a small cabin with a man who was essentially a stranger. A man who had killed 5 people to save her, a man whose presence stirred feelings she absolutely should not be experiencing, given her sacred vows to remain celibate and devoted to spiritual service alone. That night, lying in her alcove behind the hanging blanket, Catherine prayed for the first time since Morrison's raid. Not the rote prayers of her convent routine, but genuine supplication born of confusion and fear. Lord, I don't understand your plan. You allowed me to be taken beaten, nearly sold like cattle. Then you sent a killer to save me. Now I'm trapped with him in a place so isolated, even you might struggle to find us. What am I supposed to learn from this? What are you trying to tell me? No answer came, only the wind picking up outside and the crackle of the fire Elijah maintained with such care. Eventually exhausted by confusion and recovering injuries, Catherine fell into uneasy sleep. She dreamed of Morrison's face, of hands grabbing her, of the chapel floor slick with Mother Superior's blood. She woke screaming. Elijah materialized beside her alcove in seconds, moving with the silent speed of someone whose wartime experience had made hypervigilance second nature. He stood carefully outside the partition, not crossing the invisible barrier even in crisis. Nightmare! Catherine gasped, trying to control her breathing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. Don't apologize for trauma. Elijah's voice carried a gentleness she hadn't heard before. It helps to talk sometimes, if you want. Catherine found herself speaking, not about the raid, but about everything. About her mother dying when Catherine was 17. About her father's hasty remarriage to a woman who made Catherine's life unbearable with constant accusations and petty cruelties. About fleeing to the convent at 19, convinced God was calling her to religious life. But I don't think it was God's call, Catherine admitted in the darkness. I think I was just running, looking for a place no one could hurt me. Did you find it? Elijah asked quietly. Catherine laughed, the sound bitter. I found 5 years of service and doubt. I tried to feel what the other sisters described. That certainty of purpose, that connection to divine calling. It never came. I kept waiting, kept praying, kept hoping I would eventually understand why God wanted me there. Then Morrison shattered even the illusion of safety. Maybe God didn't want you there. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. What? Maybe you were supposed to learn you're stronger than you thought. That you could survive what happened and come out still yourself. Maybe the convent was preparation for whatever comes next, not the destination. Catherine had never considered her vows as anything other than permanent. The idea that they might be temporary, that God might have an entirely different plan, felt both liberating and terrifying. And what comes next, she whispered, that's for you to decide. Not the church, not your father, not Morrison, or anyone else. You, Catherine. Your choice. It was the first time he had used her given name instead of sister. The intimacy of it paired with the radical suggestion that she possessed agency over her own life left Catherine speechless. Dawn. The blizzard. November brought the serious cold. Elijah's predictions proved accurate. Snow fell steadily for days, bearing the cabin to its windows. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid within seconds of exposure to air. The trails disappeared under drifts measured in feet rather than inches. Isolation became absolute. Catherine and Elijah fell into rhythms born of necessity. They worked together to maintain the cabin against the brutal assault of a Colorado mountain winter. Catherine cooked while Elijah hunted during the brief hours when conditions permitted. She mended while he chopped endless cords of firewood. They rationed supplies with military precision, calculating how to stretch resources through months of potential confinement. The close quarters forced familiarity despite Elijah's careful maintenance of physical boundaries. Catherine learned his routines, the way he woke before dawn, regardless of weather, how he checked and rechecked supplies, with the obsessive thoroughness of someone for whom preparation meant survival. His habit of reading by firelight each evening, lips moving silently through passages he had probably memorized years ago. She learned about his past in fragments. He had married young to Mary Stone, a Vermont girl whose laugh could light up a room. They had bought a small farm and dreamed of filling it with children. When Mary became pregnant, they decided to move west for better opportunities. The journey had gone smoothly until labor began 3 days from the nearest doctor. Elijah's voice went flat as he recounted Mary's death. The complications he couldn't treat. The baby daughter born alive but dying within hours despite everything he tried. The helplessness of watching two people he loved more than life itself slip away while he remained powerless to save them. I buried them under an oak tree in Kansas, Elijah finished quietly. Then I joined the army. Needed something to do with the rage. War at least gives you targets for grief. Catherine understood then why he lived alone. why he had come to these mountains where human contact was rare and emotional connection even rarer. Grief had driven him to isolation, and isolation had become comfortable. The hard shell he wore wasn't cruelty, but protection. Defense against ever caring enough to be destroyed by loss again. The blizzard that would test everything arrived the week before December. Elijah read the signs in the afternoon sky and immediately began emergency preparations. The storm that followed eclipsed anything in his 8 years on the mountain. Wind hammered the cabin with the force of ocean waves. Snow piled so fast they heard the deadly accumulation despite thick walls. The temperature inside dropped steadily, no matter how much wood they fed the fire. On the third day, Elijah made a grim calculation. Firewood is critical, he said, studying their dwindling supply. We can't burn at this rate for 4 more days. We'll run out and then we freeze. What can we do? Catherine asked, fighting down panic. Share body heat. Humans generate warmth. 2 people together under blankets can survive with less fire than 2 people separate. It's the only way to stretch our fuel. Catherine's breath caught. The implications were obvious and impossible to ignore. They would need to lie together, pressed close in the small sleeping area, relying on each other's warmth to survive. The violation of her vows seemed secondary to the violation of the careful distance they had maintained. But the alternative was freezing to death. I'll keep my clothes on, Elijah said, not meeting her eyes. You keep yours. We just need to not freeze. Nothing else. That night they arranged themselves under every blanket in the cabin. Elijah's body radiated heat like a forge. Catherine had forgotten what it felt like to be held, how human touch could communicate safety. She lay rigid at first, hyper-aware of every point of contact, but exhaustion and hypothermia gradually overwhelmed propriety. She relaxed against him. Elijah's arm came around her waist, carefully positioning for maximum warmth transfer with minimum presumption. His breath stirred the hair at the nape of her neck. Through layers of clothing and blankets, Catherine could feel his heartbeat steady and strong. Tell me about the war, she whispered into the darkness. Anything to distract from the dangerous intimacy of their position. Elijah was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice came quiet and measured. I killed boys, Catherine. 17, 18 years old. Too young to shave, dying in mud because old men sent them to fight over ideas they barely understood. I took 43 lives that the army counted, probably 60 or 70 total. I was good at it. Too good. In war, Catherine said, defending your country, protecting other soldiers. Does that make it better? They're still dead, still had mothers who mourned them. I tell myself it was necessary that they would have killed me or my friends if I hesitated. But necessity and morality aren't always the same thing. Catherine thought of Morrison, of the 5 men Elijah had killed to save her and the others. And Morrison's men, do you regret them? No, the word came without hesitation. They chose it to traffic women. They chose violence and exploitation. Some actions forfeit your right to mercy. I slept fine after killing them. All 5, Catherine asked, remembering something from a half-conscious conversation days after her rescue. Elijah's body tensed slightly. You heard that. You said 3 died in the clearing. What about the other 2? A long pause filled only by wind howling outside. Finally, Elijah spoke with the tone of someone making a confession. I tracked them. They ran east through the forest, probably heading for the trading post to gather reinforcements or report back to whoever runs Morrison's operation. I couldn't let them get away. They knew where Ruth and the others were. They could have come back or sent more men. So you hunted them? Yes. Took 6 hours to catch up. They were city men, didn't know how to hide tracks in the wilderness. I made it quick. Clean shots, no suffering. Left their bodies for the animals. Catherine processed this. The man holding her, keeping her alive with his warmth, was capable of methodical stalking and execution. He could track human beings through miles of forest and kill them with the same professional detachment he applied to hunting deer. She should be horrified. Her vows taught mercy, forgiveness, the sanctity of all human life. But when she tried to summon revulsion, all she felt was a dark gratitude. Those men would have destroyed Ruth, would have reported Catherine's location to Morrison's backers, would have facilitated more trafficking, more violence, more suffering. Thank you, Catherine whispered. For what? for being willing to carry that burden, for doing what needed doing, even though it cost you. Elijah's arm tightened fractionally around her waist. You're not horrified. I should be. My vows teach me I should be. But those men showed Ruth no mercy when they— Catherine's voice broke, unable to finish the sentence, describing what Morrison's gang had done to her friend. What happened to Ruth? Elijah asked, his voice gone dangerous and quiet. Catherine told him about the violation Ruth had endured during their captivity, about the broken way her friend's eyes had looked when Catherine finally saw her at the Patterson mission, about how Ruth had confessed she felt God had abandoned them to evil. Elijah's rage was a living thing in the darkness. Catherine felt it in the tension of his muscles, the rapid increase in his breathing. I should have made them suffer. Should have broken every bone before putting bullets in their skulls. No, Catherine said firmly. Your way was mercy, for them and for you. You're not a torturer, Elijah. You're a man who does hard things to protect people. Don't become something darker because of what they deserved. Silence stretched. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah's breathing returned to normal. His body relaxed by degrees. How are you this wise? He finally asked. I'm not wise. I'm confused and angry and terrified. But lying here with you, I feel safer than I ever felt in the convent. You're a killer, and that should frighten me. Instead, I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in my life. Elijah said nothing, but his hand found hers under the blankets. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture that carried more weight than words. They fell asleep like that, holding hands in the darkness, trusting each other with their warmth and their secrets. In the broken pieces of their souls, the blizzard raged for 5 days total, 5 days of forced intimacy that broke down every barrier they had constructed. They talked for hours in the darkness, about faith and doubt, about war and loss, about the impossibility of returning to who they had been before trauma reshaped them into something new. Catherine confessed her doubts about her calling, how she had never felt the certainty other sisters described, how the raid had shattered her belief in divine protection, how lying in Elijah's arms felt more like prayer than anything she had experienced in 5 years of chapel services. Elijah spoke of his isolation, how he had chosen these mountains to escape the pain of human connection, how watching Catherine recover had reminded him that life involved more than mere survival, how terrified he was of caring about someone again, only to lose them to circumstances beyond his control. On the 5th night, the wind finally died. They woke to silence in the strange twilight of a world buried in snow. Elijah extracted himself from their nest of blankets and went to dig out the door. Catherine lay alone in the alcove, missing his warmth immediately and hating herself for the yearning. When they finally emerged from the cabin, the world had transformed. Trees bent under impossible weights of snow. Drifts reached the roofline. The clearing looked like something from a fairy tale, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Catherine watched Elijah survey their situation with tactical precision. He was already planning how to hunt, how to gather more firewood, how to ensure their survival through however many more weeks of winter remained. His competence, his strength, his absolute commitment to keeping them both alive stirred something in Catherine that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with desire. She realized with sudden, terrible clarity that she had fallen in love with Elijah Stone. The admission terrified her. She had vowed celibacy, had promised herself to God's service, had committed to a life that left no room for earthly love. Breaking those vows would mean abandoning everything she had built her adult identity around. It would mean admitting the last 5 years had been a mistake. It would mean choosing the terrifying uncertainty of a future with a man who lived alone on a mountain over the safety of religious community. But standing in the snow, watching Elijah work with quiet determination to keep them alive, Catherine couldn't deny the truth. She loved him. Not with the abstract devotion she was supposed to feel for God, but with specific, fierce human love. She loved his competence and his grief, his silence and his secrets, his terrible capability for violence paired with his careful respect. Everything about him called to everything in her that had always felt constrained and confined by the narrowness of her previous choices. That night, they returned to separate sleeping arrangements. The crisis had passed. The fire could be maintained at normal levels. There was no practical need to share warmth anymore. Catherine lay alone in her alcove, missing him, missing the sound of his breathing, the solid presence of his body, the simple human comfort of not being alone. Outside, Elijah stood beneath the stars, arms crossed against the cold, staring at nothing. He knew he loved her, had probably known since the blizzard's first night when she had trusted him enough to sleep in his arms, despite every reason to fear him. But loving Catherine meant eventually losing her. Come spring, she would return to the Patterson mission, would reunite with Ruth and the other sisters, would resume her religious life, or find some other path that didn't include a broken mountain hermit with blood on his hands. The smart choice, the safe choice, was to maintain distance until weather permitted her departure, protect himself from the inevitable pain of watching her leave, never speak the words forming like prayers in his heart. But Elijah had learned in war and grief that safety was an illusion, that protecting yourself from pain often meant missing the only things that made life worth the living. That love was the greatest risk and the greatest reward, and refusing to take that risk meant dying slowly instead of living fully. He loved her. Come spring, he would let her go. But until then, he would allow himself the dangerous luxury of hoping she might choose to stay. In separate spaces, both awake, both aching, Catherine and Elijah Stone faced the terrible truth that solitude was easier than love, but love was what made solitude unbearable. The winter stretched ahead, full of moments that would test everything they believed about duty and desire, vows and choice, safety and freedom. The blizzard had passed. The real storm was just beginning. January arrived with the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made every inhalation feel like swallowing knives. Catherine stood at the cabin window watching morning light paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Behind her, Elijah worked at preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. 3 months since the blizzard. 3 months of careful distance maintained despite 5 nights of forced intimacy. 3 months of unspoken feelings growing heavier with each passing day. They had developed routines to manage the awkwardness. Catherine woke first now, dressed behind her partition, and started the fire. Elijah emerged only after hearing her moving about, giving them both the illusion of privacy. They worked in comfortable silence. She prepared meals while he maintained their supplies. Evenings found them on opposite sides of the cabin, Catherine mending by lamplight, while Elijah read. But the reading had changed. Where once he had spent evenings alone with his books, now Elijah asked Catherine to read aloud. Her convent education had given her a clear, expressive voice that brought even familiar passages to unexpected life. She read from the Bible, though neither discussed the irony of a nun who doubted her calling, reading scripture to a killer who believed in divine justice. She read poetry, Shakespeare's sonnets, that spoke of love with a directness that made the air between them feel charged with possibility. And she taught him. Elijah could read functionally enough to survive, but years of isolation had left gaps in his education. Catherine filled those gaps with patient instruction, watching pride bloom in his eyes when he successfully navigated increasingly complex passages. "Why are you doing this?" Elijah asked one evening, as Catherine corrected his pronunciation of a particularly troublesome word. "Because intelligence shouldn't be wasted," Catherine replied. "You're smart, Elijah. You deserve to access knowledge, not just stumble through it. And because it gives us something to do besides think about spring." Catherine's hand stilled on the page. Spring. The word hung between them like a sword. Meant melting snow, passable trails, her departure for the Patterson mission and whatever came after. The end of this strange interlude where they existed outside normal society's rules and expectations. "Do you think about spring?" Catherine asked quietly. Elijah's pale blue eyes met hers across the cabin. "Every day. You thought that every night." The admission cost something to speak aloud. They had been so careful not to acknowledge the thing growing between them, not to name the way Catherine's pulse quickened when Elijah's hand accidentally brushed hers, not to mention how Elijah found excuses to linger near wherever Catherine worked, not to speak of the dreams that woke Catherine aching with wants her vows forbade and her heart demanded. February brought a letter that changed everything. A trader making the dangerous winter journey to outlying cabins appeared at their door, half frozen and looking for shelter. Elijah took him in without hesitation, providing warmth and food in exchange for news from the wider world. The trader carried mail collected from the Patterson mission, including a letter addressed to Sister Catherine Morgan. Catherine recognized Ruth's handwriting immediately. She retreated to her alcove to read, her hands trembling as she broke the wax seal. The letter spoke of recovery, both physical and spiritual. Ruth wrote of the kindness the Patterson family had shown, of slowly rebuilding shattered faith through the practical work of helping others, of questions that plagued her about whether God had truly called her to religious life, or whether she, like Catherine, had been running from pain rather than toward purpose. Then came the revelation that made Catherine's breath catch. "The diocese has offered to release me from my vows," Ruth wrote. "They say the trauma of what happened constitutes grounds for dispensation. I could leave religious life honorably without the stain of breaking sacred promises. I haven't decided yet. How can I abandon what I've devoted years to building? But how can I continue serving when I feel God abandoned us to Morrison's violence? Sister Catherine, you haven't written about your situation with the mountain man. I pray you're safe, that he treats you with respect, that when spring comes, you'll return to us and we can help each other navigate whatever comes next. But I wonder sometimes if safety is what we need. Maybe we need the courage to choose new paths instead of retreating to old ones that never quite fit." Catherine read the letter 3 times each pass, revealing new layers of meaning. The church recognized that trauma could invalidate vows taken in innocence, that suffering could transform commitment into imprisonment, that there was honor in acknowledging when a calling proved false rather than sacrificing your life to a mistake. She could leave, not as someone breaking promises, but as someone released from commitments made by a younger, more naive version of herself. She could choose Elijah, choose this mountain, choose a future that terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. If he wanted her, if she had the courage to ask. When Catherine emerged from her alcove, she found Elijah studying her expression with the tactical assessment he applied to potential threats. "Bad news, complicated news." Catherine handed him the letter. "Ruth is questioning her vows. The diocese offered release." Elijah read slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he carefully refolded the paper and returned it to Catherine. "What will she do?" "I don't know. What would you do, Me?" Elijah's laugh held no humor. "I'm the worst person to ask about religious commitment. I believe in God, but I've killed too many people to pretend I understand his plans." "But you understand choice, living with consequences." Elijah moved to the window, staring out at mountains that had become his church, his penance, his refuge. "I'd tell her to choose truth over comfort. Better to live honestly in difficulty than pretend contentment in a lie. But that's easy to say when you're not the one making the choice." Catherine joined him at the window, close enough that she could feel heat radiating from his body, close enough to be dangerous. "And if I could get the same release, would you counsel me to leave or stay?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elijah's jaw tightened. That tiny movement, Catherine had learned, meant he was fighting powerful emotions beneath his calm exterior. "I'd tell you to go back, resume your life, find a good man in some settlement town, build the family you deserve." "Why, Tom?" "Because I can't give you children, Catherine." The words came out raw and broken. "After Mary died, after holding my daughter as she choked on her first and last breaths, I can't. The thought of someone I love pregnant makes me physically ill. I see Mary bleeding out, hear the baby's weak cries, and I can't breathe. So no matter what I feel for you, I can't offer you a real future. Just half a life with a damaged hermit on a mountain." Catherine absorbed this confession. The wound at Elijah's core that had driven him to isolation now stood revealed. Not just grief for what he'd lost, but terror of experiencing it again. A trauma so profound it had reshaped his fundamental capacity for hope. "I don't need children," Catherine said softly. "I need honesty, partnership, a man who sees me as an equal rather than property or a vessel for continuing his bloodline. You say that now, but 5 years from now, 10, when all your friends have families and you're still just the mountain hermit's wife, would I be your wife?" Elijah turned to face her fully. The naked longing in his expression made Catherine's heart stutter. "Yes, if you'd have me, if you could accept the limitations." "I love you, Catherine. Have since the blizzard, maybe before. But loving you means wanting what's best for you, and I'm not sure that's me. That's my choice to make." Catherine reached up her hand, trembling, as she touched his bearded jaw. "You don't get to decide what I need. You don't get to sacrifice yourself to save me from a future you think I'll regret. I'm capable of knowing my own heart." Elijah caught her hand, pressing it against his face with desperate tenderness. Your heart might not know what it's choosing. Gratitude feels like love sometimes. Isolation makes people think they want things they'd reject in normal circumstances. The frustration that had been building in Catherine for months finally broke through her careful control. Don't tell me what I feel. I know the difference between gratitude and love. I loved you when you taught me to track deer in the snow, when you sat outside my alcove during nightmares and talked until I could sleep again, when you trusted me enough to confess the worst parts of yourself and didn't flinch when I still wanted you anyway. Catherine, I love you, Elijah Stone. Not because you saved me, but because you're honorable and broken and trying so hard to be better than you think you are. Because you carry impossible burdens and never complain. Because you made me feel alive in ways I never felt kneeling in chapel. And if you send me away come spring because you've decided what's best for me, I'll go. But I'll resent you for the rest of my life for stealing my choice. Elijah stared at her, something crumbling in his expression. I'm terrified of losing you. Then don't push me away before you have to. The distance between them collapsed. Elijah's mouth found hers with desperate hunger. Catherine's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, 5 months of denied want pouring into the kiss. He tasted like coffee and wood smoke and home. His hands cradled her face with a reverence that made her want to weep. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. This is probably a sin. Definitely a sin, Catherine agreed. I'm technically still bound by vows of celibacy. We should stop. We should. Neither moved. Elijah's thumb traced the curve of Catherine's cheekbone. Come spring, I'll take you to Denver. We'll petition the diocese for your release. Do it properly. And if they grant it, if you still want this, I'll marry you. Build you a real cabin instead of this shack. Try to be the man you deserve. And if they don't grant release, Elijah's expression hardened into something implacable. Then we'll build that cabin anyway. I won't let the church trap you any more than I let Morrison. Your soul is yours, Catherine. No institution gets to claim ownership. The word should have shocked her, should have triggered the obedience trained into her through 5 years of religious discipline. Instead, Catherine felt only relief that someone finally recognized her fundamental right to self-determination. She kissed him again, softer this time, a promise rather than a claiming. They stood together at the window watching snow fall over mountains that had become their sanctuary, both terrified and exhilarated by the future they were choosing to build. March brought signs of coming spring. Icicles dripped from the cabin's eaves. The snowpack began its slow transformation from solid barrier to something that would eventually permit passage. Elijah started planning the journey to Denver with tactical precision, calculating supplies and timing, and the best route for a woman still building strength after months of recovery. But he also grew distant, not in action, but in spirit. Catherine caught him, staring at nothing, his expression bleak. At night, she heard him moving restlessly beyond the partition. The man who had confessed love now seemed to be withdrawing from it, and Catherine couldn't understand why. Until the evening, he finally spoke what haunted him. Catherine, we need to discuss something. Elijah's voice carried the same flat tone he'd used describing the war, reciting facts too painful for emotion. When I take you to Denver, when we petition for release and assume it's granted, you need to understand the full reality of what you're choosing. I understand. You don't. Elijah sat across from her, his hands clenched together. I've been alone 8 years. I don't know how to live with someone. I wake before dawn from nightmares I'll never fully explain. Some mornings I need hours of silence before I can speak. I forget that normal people have conversations instead of comfortable quiet. I'm better with my rifle than with words, and I'm going to hurt your feelings when I don't mean to because I'm not practiced at considering someone else's emotional needs. Elijah, I'm not finished. His pale eyes met hers with terrible honesty. I can't have children. Not just won't, but can't. The psychological barrier is too strong. Even if you're fine without them now. What about in 5 years when your friends have babies and you're still childless? What about when you meet some rancher's son who can give you the normal life you deserve? The regret will poison what we have. Catherine listened to him catalog all the reasons she should reject him, all the ways he believed himself inadequate for her. And she understood finally what was happening. Elijah wasn't withdrawing because he stopped loving her. He was preparing to let her go, because he loved her enough to want better for her, even if better meant losing her. Are you finished? Catherine asked when he fell silent. Yes. Good. Now hear me. Catherine leaned forward, making sure he couldn't avoid her gaze. I don't want normal. Normal was a convent where I never belonged. Normal was a father who remarried and forgot I existed. Normal has never worked for me, Elijah. I want honest. I want a partner who treats me as an equal. I want someone brave enough to show me his worst parts and trust me to still choose him. You might change your mind. I might. So might you. That's the nature of choice. We risk getting it wrong, but I'd rather risk choosing you and potentially regretting it than play it safe and definitely regret not trying. Elijah looked at her with such desperate hope it made Catherine's chest ache. You're sure? I'm terrified. But yes, I'm sure. Baish. The tension that had been coiling tighter in Elijah for weeks finally released. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides and pulled Catherine into his arms, burying his face in her hair. She felt him trembling and realized this strong, dangerous man was crying. Not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being chosen despite all his damage and limitations. They stood like that until Elijah's breathing steadied. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red, but clearer than Catherine had ever seen them. We'll make this work, he said. Whatever comes, we'll figure it out together. Together, Catherine agreed. That night, they moved Catherine's sleeping pallet closer to the fire, not sharing space yet maintaining propriety until proper marriage could formalize their commitment, but close enough to talk in the darkness, close enough to reach across the small distance and clasp hands, close enough to stop pretending distance would protect either of them from the risk of love. April arrived with the violence of winter releasing its grip on the high country. Ice cracked, streams roared with meltwater. The trails remained treacherous, but no longer impossible. And with the thaw came visitors. The sound of horses approaching brought Elijah to the door with rifle ready. Catherine joined him, her own weapon now carried with the confidence of months of practice. Through the trees she counted 8 riders. Too many for a casual visit. The lead horse carried a man whose refined bearing immediately triggered Catherine's warning instincts. Jake Morrison had returned. Catherine's breath caught as Morrison emerged into the clearing. His left shoulder sat lower than the right, permanently damaged from Elijah's bullet. The scars Catherine's fingernails had carved still marked his face like brands. But he smiled with the same cold confidence as 6 months ago, backed now by superior numbers and something more dangerous, the appearance of legal authority. Beside Morrison rode a man in the dark coat and severe expression of a federal marshal. Behind them 6 hard-faced men wearing the mix of expensive gear and casual violence that marked professional muscle. Mr. Stone, Morrison called out, his voice carrying false pleasantry. I've returned to collect what's mine. Legally this time. Elijah's rifle never wavered from Morrison's chest. You're not welcome here. Leave. The marshal urged his horse forward. Middle-aged, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in hard country. His badge caught the morning light. I'm Marshal Thomas Garrett, federal appointment out of Denver. I have a warrant regarding Sister Catherine Morgan. A warrant for what? Catherine demanded, stepping to Elijah's side despite his low sound of protest. Garrett studied her with the flat assessment of someone evaluating property rather than people. Mr. Morrison here has presented documentation showing St. Mary's Convent owed significant debts to business interests he represents. You and the other sisters were removed as collateral recovery. His claim is legal and documented. It's a lie. Catherine's hands clenched into fists. Morrison trafficked us. He beat Mother Superior unconscious and planned to sell us to mining camps. Morrison's smile never wavered. Slander is a crime, sister. I rescued you from a failing institution that couldn't meet its obligations. Stone interfered with legal debt recovery, stole you and the others. I'm simply reclaiming what's rightfully mine through proper channels. I have papers, Garrett added, producing folded documents from his coat. Signed contracts, witness statements, everything legally required to establish Mr. Morrison's claim. Ma'am, I understand this is difficult, but you need to come with us while this gets sorted in Denver courts. Elijah's voice dropped into a register Catherine had learned meant extreme danger. Marshal, she was trafficked. Morrison beat her badly enough to crack ribs. He violated her companion, Sister Ruth. The papers you're holding are forged. That's not what my documentation says. And without evidence to contradict legal documents, I have to enforce the warrant. Garrett's hand moved to rest on his sidearm. Not quite a threat, but close. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Catherine felt ice spreading through her veins. Morrison had prepared for this encounter, had spent months constructing a legal framework that transformed trafficking into debt recovery, had probably bribed or deceived Garrett into believing his lies. They weren't facing a simple criminal anymore. They were facing someone who understood how to weaponize the law itself. I'm not going anywhere with him, Catherine said clearly. Marshall, you're being used. Those documents are forgeries designed to give trafficking a veneer of legality. Morrison's facade cracked slightly, revealing the monster beneath. Careful, sister. Accusing a federal marshal of corruption is serious business. I'm not accusing him. I'm accusing you. Catherine took another step forward despite Elijah's warning hand on her arm. You're a criminal pretending to be legitimate, and I'll testify to that in any court that will hear me. From a nunnery. Morrison's smile returned sharp and cruel. Your vows make you church property, sister. You have no legal standing to testify without your Mother Superior's permission. And since she's conveniently unavailable due to injuries sustained in the unfortunate raid on your convent well, perhaps Mr. Stone should release you to proper authority. The trap became clear. Morrison had constructed multiple layers of legal complexity to ensure Catherine's voice didn't matter. As a nun, her testimony could be blocked. As someone without independent legal standing, her agency disappeared. The very vows she had been preparing to renounce now became chains Morrison planned to use. Elijah raised his rifle fractionally. She's not going anywhere, neither is anyone else unless it's you leaving, vertically or otherwise. Garrett's hand tightened on his weapon. Mr. Stone threatening a federal marshal is a hanging offense. Put the rifle down. Not happening, Morrison laughed. You see, Marshal Stone's a dangerous man. Former sharpshooter rumored to have killed 3 bandits in '65. Who knows what he's done to that poor woman during months of isolation? She's clearly been compromised, possibly coerced. We're doing her a favor, removing her from his influence. Catherine's mind raced, searching for options. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Garrett believed Morrison's lies or had been paid enough not to care about truth. Elijah could probably kill several of them before being overwhelmed, but that would make him a cop killer and solve nothing. They needed a different strategy. Give us a week, Catherine said suddenly. Everyone turned to stare at her. She focused on Garrett, gambling that underneath bureaucratic compliance he retained some capacity for fairness. You say you have legal documents. Fine. Give us 1 week to travel to Denver ourselves. We'll present counter evidence. Let an actual judge examine both sides instead of executing a warrant based on papers you haven't verified. Garrett frowned. The warrant is clear. I'm authorized to take you into custody now. Authorized, not required, Catherine pressed. Marshal, you look like a man who values justice over just following orders. If Morrison's claims are legitimate, they'll stand up to scrutiny. If they're not, you'll have participated in trafficking a woman. Which do you want on your conscience? The appeal to conscience worked better than Catherine expected. Garrett studied Morrison with new suspicion. Why the rush? If your documentation is sound, it should survive examination. Morrison's facade cracked further. Because Stone is dangerous. Every day she remains with him is a day she's at risk. Yet she seems quite capable of speaking for herself, Garrett observed. And I notice she's armed. Doesn't look particularly coerced to me. The standoff stretched. Catherine could see Garrett's conviction wavering. Morrison had probably bribed him, but the amount couldn't have been enough to justify ignoring obvious holes in the trafficking story. The marshal struck Catherine as corrupt but not evil, someone who cut corners but might balk at outright facilitating slavery. Finally, Garrett spoke. 3 days. You get 3 days to present yourself in Denver with whatever evidence you have. If you don't show, I'll come back with 20 men and we'll settle this the hard way. Understood. Catherine wanted to argue for the full week, but 3 days was better than being dragged to Denver in chains. Understood. Morrison's face contorted with rage. Marshal, we agreed that. The slip was small, but fatal. Garrett's expression went cold. You paid what Mr. Morrison. Nothing, I misspoke. Uh-huh. Garrett gathered his reins suddenly, looking eager to be away from Morrison's presence. 3 days, Mr. Stone. Denver Courthouse. Bring Sister Catherine and anything that contradicts these documents. I'll ensure Judge Brennan hears both sides before making any decisions about custody. Morrison started to protest, but Garrett cut him off with a look that promised violence if pushed further. We're leaving. Now. The group departed with Morrison shooting murderous glares at Catherine and Elijah. When the sound of hooves faded, Elijah finally lowered his rifle. His hands shook slightly with adrenaline. 3 days isn't enough time to petition the diocese and get your vows released, he said quietly. I know. Catherine's mind was already racing ahead. We'll have to argue based on trafficking and false documentation. Prove Morrison's claims are fabricated. Convince the judge I'm not property, regardless of what papers say. And if the judge sides with Morrison, Catherine met Elijah's gaze with absolute certainty. Then we run. I'd rather spend my life in hiding with you than 5 minutes in Morrison's custody. Elijah pulled her close, his heart hammering against her ear. I should have killed him 6 months ago. Should have tracked him down and finished what I started. No, we're going to beat him legally. Prove his documentation is forged. Make him pay through the system instead of outside it. You have more faith in the law than I do. Catherine thought of her months in the convent, of taking vows too young, committing to a calling that never fit, of how institutions could trap people as effectively as chains. But she also thought of judges who might care about justice, of marshals who could be swayed by conscience, of systems that sometimes occasionally protected the powerless instead of just serving the powerful. I have faith in truth, she said, and the truth is Morrison's a criminal. We just need someone with authority willing to see it. The next 3 days passed in frantic preparation. Elijah used his war training to create detailed testimony about the rescue. Catherine drafted accounts of the trafficking, the beatings, Morrison's explicit statements about selling women. They compiled physical evidence, Catherine's scars, the torn habits she'd kept, Elijah's description of the clearing where he'd found Morrison's operation. But they both knew evidence might not be enough. The system favored men like Morrison. Rich, connected, skilled at working legal loopholes. Catherine's word as a nun might carry no weight. Elijah's testimony as a known killer could be dismissed. They were preparing for a battle they might well lose. On the second night, as they worked by lamplight, Catherine paused. Elijah, if this goes badly, if the judge rules for Morrison, I want you to promise me something. Anything. Don't do anything stupid trying to rescue me. Don't attack the courthouse or assault federal marshals or become an outlaw. Elijah's jaw set with familiar stubbornness. You're asking me to abandon you. I'm asking you to survive, to trust that I'll find a way to fight from inside the system. If you turn yourself into a fugitive, we lose any chance at a legitimate future together. Catherine, promise me. She took his hands, holding tight. I love you too much to watch you throw your life away. Promise you'll let the law play out whatever it decides. The promise cost Elijah something to speak. Catherine saw it in the way his throat worked, the moisture gathering in his pale eyes. I promise to try, but if Morrison hurts you, all bets are off. It was the best compromise she would get. Catherine kissed him, pouring everything she felt into the connection. Fear and hope and love and determination. When they broke apart, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. 3 years ago, I thought I'd die alone on this mountain, he said quietly. Now I can't imagine a future without you in it. We're going to win, Catherine. We have to. Catherine wished she shared his certainty, but she'd learned over months with Elijah that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act despite being terrified. And right now, facing the prospect of standing before a judge who might legally hand her over to the man who trafficked her, Catherine had never been more afraid in her life. But she would face that fear, would walk into that courthouse and fight for her freedom with every tool available, because the alternative was accepting that women like her were property, that Morrison's money and forged papers trumped her fundamental humanity, that the law existed to protect predators rather than their prey. On the morning of the third day, they rode toward Denver. The trail down the mountain was treacherous with spring melt, but Elijah navigated it with expert precision. Catherine rode behind him, arms wrapped around his waist, drawing strength from his solid presence. Halfway down, they encountered an unexpected sight, a lone rider coming up the trail wearing the black coat and white collar of a Catholic priest. As they drew closer, Catherine recognized him with a shock that nearly unseated her. Father Benedict Walsh, the priest who had performed her confirmation 7 years ago in Boston, before she'd fled west. The man who had counseled her through her mother's death and encouraged her vocation. The spiritual advisor she hadn't seen since taking her final vows. Father Benedict reined his horse to a stop, his weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. "Sister Catherine, is that truly you?" Catherine dismounted on shaking legs. "Father Benedict, what are you doing here?" "Looking for you, child. When news of the raid on St. Mary's reached in the diocese, I volunteered to investigate. The Patterson family told me you were with a mountain man named Elijah Stone." His gaze shifted to Elijah with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "I assume you're the man who saved her." Elijah nodded, suddenly looking uncomfortable with priestly scrutiny. Benedict's attention returned to Catherine. "I'm glad to find you safe. Mother Superior has recovered enough to speak. She told us everything about the attack. The church wants to help however possible." Catherine felt hope kindle. "Father, we're heading to Denver for a legal hearing. Jake Morrison, the man who trafficked us, is claiming he has legal rights to custody. He's forged documents suggesting the convent owed debts. We need to prove he's lying." Benedict's expression darkened. "Morrison, yes, I've heard that name. A known criminal with enough money to corrupt officials. Dangerous man." His gaze sharpened on Catherine. "But that's not all you came down the mountain to discuss, is it?" Catherine glanced at Elijah, drawing courage from his slight nod. "No, Father, I need to petition for release from my vows. I don't believe I was truly called to religious life. I was running from pain, not toward God. And I've found—" She reached for Elijah's hand. "I've found something real. Something honest. Someone who sees me as a person rather than a symbol." Benedict studied their joined hands with an unreadable expression. "Sister Catherine, you took solemn vows before God and the church. You can't simply abandon them because you've developed feelings for a man. They weren't solemn when I took them, Father. They were desperate. I was 19, grieving my mother, trapped in a home where my stepmother made every day hell. I chose the convent because it was escape, not calling. 5 years I've tried to feel what the other sisters described. That certainty of purpose. That connection to divine will. It never came. And you think this mountain man represents God's true plan?" Benedict's tone held skepticism but also genuine curiosity. "I think trauma revealed that I'd been lying to myself," Catherine said carefully. "Morrison's attack shattered my illusion of religious safety, but Elijah showed me that strength and honor exist outside institutional validation, that love can be sacred without being sanctioned by the church." Benedict dismounted, moving closer to examine Catherine's face with the intensity of someone looking for truth beneath polite words. "You love him?" "Yes." "And you, Mr. Stone?" Benedict turned his priestly scrutiny on Elijah. "What are your intentions toward this woman?" Elijah met the priest's gaze without flinching. "To marry her if she'll have me, and if the church releases her vows. To protect her. To build a life together that honors her intelligence and strength. To give her choices instead of taking them away." "Can you give her children?" The blunt question made Elijah's jaw tighten, but he answered honestly. "No, I'm psychologically incapable. My first wife and daughter died in childbirth. The trauma runs too deep." "And you accept this?" Benedict asked Catherine. "Yes, I don't need children, Father. I need partnership, respect, the freedom to choose my own path." Benedict fell silent, clearly wrestling with competing obligations. As a priest, he should encourage Catherine to honor her vows. As someone who had known her since childhood, he could probably see that those vows had always sat awkwardly on her shoulders. "Come," he said finally. "We'll ride to Denver together. I'll testify about the raid if needed. And I'll—" He paused, something shifting in his expression. "I'll pray for guidance about your petition. The diocese will need time to consider such a request, but perhaps I can expedite the process given the unusual circumstances." It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. Catherine felt tears of gratitude well up. "Thank you, Father." Benedict's stern expression softened slightly. "Don't thank me yet, child. The path you're choosing will not be easy. Society is unkind to women who abandon religious vocations. The church itself may oppose your release, and if you pursue this course, there's no returning. You understand that? I understand. Then let's get you to Denver and deal with Morrison first, one crisis at a time. They rode together down the mountain, three unlikely companions bound by circumstance and competing loyalties. Father Benedict maintained thoughtful silence most of the journey, occasionally asking Catherine questions about her time in the convent. Not challenging her decision, but probing to ensure it came from genuine discernment rather than temporary infatuation. Elijah rode tense and watchful, clearly uncomfortable, with priestly examination, but enduring it for Catherine's sake. His hand never strayed far from his rifle. The closer they got to Denver, the more his wartime vigilance reasserted itself. They were riding into potential danger, into a legal system that might not care about justice, into Morrison's prepared trap. That night, they camped a few miles outside Denver. Father Benedict performed evening prayers with Catherine, joining from habit, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. Elijah sat apart, maintaining respectful distance from the religious ritual while keeping watch over their camp. After prayers, Benedict gestured for Catherine to walk with him. They moved far enough from the fire to speak privately, and the priest's expression suggested the real conversation was finally beginning. Catherine, Benedict said gently, I need you to be absolutely certain about what you're doing. Not because the church demands it, but because I care about your welfare. You're contemplating abandoning vows, entering a relationship with a man who has killed, possibly living as an outcast in mountain isolation. This is not a small decision. I know, Father. Do you? Because I see a young woman who's been through tremendous trauma, who's formed an attachment to her rescuer under extraordinary circumstances. Gratitude and isolation can create feelings that seem like love, but might not survive ordinary life. It was the same argument Elijah had made months ago. Catherine had her answer prepared. Father, I know the difference between gratitude and love. I'm grateful to Elijah for saving me, yes. But I love him because he's honorable despite his capacity for violence. Because he treats me as an intellectual equal. Because he makes me feel alive in ways I never felt kneeling in chapel. Because he's given me the freedom to choose him rather than demanding I stay. He told you he cannot have children. You're young, Catherine. That limitation might seem acceptable now, but in 10 years, Father, I watched my mother die giving birth to a stillborn child. I've seen women destroyed by pregnancy complications, by losing babies, by the expectation that their value lies in reproduction. If I never bear children, I'll grieve what might have been. But I'd rather live honestly with Elijah than pretend to want something I'm not certain I need. Benedict studied her in the moonlight. You've changed. The girl I confirmed would never have spoken with such certainty. That girl was trying to be what everyone expected. This woman is trying to be honest. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Benedict sighed. The diocese has already been reviewing your case because of the trauma. Mother Superior included a note suggesting that Sister Catherine Morgan might benefit from reconsideration of her vocation. I was empowered to evaluate and, if warranted, grant preliminary release pending full canonical process. Catherine's heart stopped. Preliminary release, not full dispensation. That requires months of documentation and theological review. But temporary suspension of vows while the formal process unfolds. It would allow you to leave religious life honorably while the church determines final status. You could do that, Al. I could. The question is whether I should. Benedict's gaze sharpened. If I grant this, Catherine, you must be absolutely certain. Because even if you change your mind later, the process is difficult to reverse. You would be choosing uncertainty over the stability of religious community. Catherine thought of the blizzard, of Elijah's arms around her, keeping her alive through cold that would have killed her alone, of teaching him to read and watching pride bloom in his eyes, of conversations that range from theology to tactics, from grief to hope, of feeling seen and valued in ways the convent had never provided. I'm certain, Father, more certain than I was at 19 when I took vows thinking I was hearing God's call. This feels like the first real choice I've made in years. Benedict reached into his coat and withdrew official-looking papers. Then I grant preliminary release from your vows, effective immediately pending full canonical review. You are no longer bound by the promises of poverty, chastity, or obedience to religious superiors. You may leave the religious life and pursue secular marriage if you choose. Do you accept this release? Catherine's voice shook. I accept. Then in the eyes of the church, though not yet finalized in canon law, you are free. Benedict handed her the documents. These should suffice for legal purposes in Morrison's hearing. You're not church property. You have full standing to testify and make decisions about your own future. Catherine stared at the papers through tears. Freedom official and documented. The chains she'd worn for 5 years dissolved in ink and priestly authority. She wanted to laugh and cry simultaneously. Thank you, she whispered. Father, thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still have to face Morrison and whatever corrupted judge he's purchased. And Catherine, Benedict's expression softened. I'm doing this because I believe God's call comes in many forms. Sometimes it's to religious life. Sometimes it's to honest partnership with a good man. I think you found the latter. Don't let anyone, including the formal church, tell you otherwise. Catherine embraced him, this priest who had known her since childhood and cared enough to break with rigid tradition for her welfare. When she returned to the campfire, Elijah read the truth in her expression. What happened? Catherine handed him the release documents, watched his eyes widen as he processed their meaning. I'm free, officially released from vows pending final church review. Morrison can't claim that I'm church property anymore. Elijah pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in a circle. For the first time since she'd known him, pure joy transformed his usually controlled expression. He looked young, unburdened, full of hope instead of grief. We're going to win, he said fiercely. Tomorrow we'll face Morrison and his forged papers and whatever judge he's bought. And we're going to destroy him legally, Catherine. Make him pay for every woman he's trafficked, every lie he's told. Catherine kissed him, not caring that Father Benedict could see. She was no longer bound by celibacy, no longer required to maintain the appearance of religious propriety. She was free to choose this man, this love, this terrifying and exhilarating future. Together, she said when they broke apart. Together, Elijah agreed. That night, they still maintained separate sleeping areas out of respect for Father Benedict's presence. But Catherine lay awake touching the release papers like a talisman, hardly believing her fortune. Tomorrow would bring Denver the courthouse Morrison's trap, but she would face it with Elijah beside her and freedom in her pocket. The night before, she had been Sister Catherine Morgan, bound by vows taken too young and held by an institution that valued her obedience over her happiness. Tomorrow she would walk into that courthouse as simply Catherine, a woman with agency, with rights, with the legal standing to defend herself against a monster. And if the judge somehow ruled for Morrison, despite the truth, Catherine touched the knife Elijah had given her months ago, now carried habitually. Then Morrison would discover that the woman he'd trafficked was no longer the frightened nun he'd beaten. She had been trained by a war veteran, loved by a killer, and freed by a priest who believed in her right to choose. Whatever came next, Catherine would face it as herself, fully, finally, freely herself. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of fire. Catherine rose to find Elijah already awake, checking weapons with methodical precision. Father Benedict performed morning prayers. And together the three of them prepared to ride into Denver and face whatever justice or injustice awaited. The chapter of Catherine's life as a nun had closed. The chapter of Catherine as Elijah's partner was beginning. But first they had to survive Jake Morrison's final attempt to chain her to a lie. The courthouse loomed ahead as they entered Denver's streets. Somewhere inside, Morrison waited with forged papers and bribed officials. But Catherine rode toward that confrontation with her head high and her hand on the documents proving her freedom. Let him try to claim her now. Let him produce his lies and his corrupt witnesses. She was no longer property. Not the church's, not Morrison's, not anyone's but her own. And she would make absolutely certain every person in that courtroom understood that truth. The real battle was about to begin. The Denver courthouse stood 3 stories tall, its stone facade designed to project the permanence and authority of law. Catherine stared at the building from across the street, her heart hammering against her ribs with the same intensity as the day Morrison's men had crashed through the convent chapel doors. But she was different now. Then she had been Sister Catherine Morgan, a woman defined by vows taken too young and an institution that valued obedience over agency. Now she stood as simply Catherine, carrying documents proving her freedom in one pocket and a knife Elijah had given her in the other. She had been trained by a war veteran, loved by a killer, who chose mercy, and freed by a priest who believed in her right to self-determination. Elijah stood beside her, his pale blue eyes scanning the street with tactical precision. 6 months ago, he had been a hermit preparing for another winter alone. Now he carried the weight of loving someone enough to face civilization's judgment, knowing that losing her would destroy what little remained of his capacity for hope. Father Benedict completed their unlikely trio, his priestly collar drawing curious glances from passing townspeople. He had spent the ride into Denver probing Catherine's certainty testing whether her choice came from genuine discernment or temporary infatuation. Satisfied finally that she understood the permanence of her decision, he had promised to testify on her behalf regardless of how the church hierarchy might view his involvement. Morrison will be inside, Elijah said quietly. Probably arrived early to position his people. The marshal too, and whatever judge he's managed to corrupt or convince. Judge Harold Brennan, Father Benedict supplied. I made inquiries this morning. He's known as fair but rigid, follows the letter of law even when the spirit might demand flexibility. Morrison chose well if he wants someone who will enforce documentation regardless of underlying truth. Catherine absorbed this. A judge who valued papers over people would favor Morrison's forged contracts over her testimony. They needed to prove not just that Morrison was lying, but that his lies violated laws the judge cared about enforcing. Then we prove the documents are fraudulent, Catherine has said with more confidence than she felt. Show the signatures are forged, the seals are fake, the entire legal framework is constructed to give trafficking a veneer of legitimacy. Do you have evidence of forgery? Benedict asked. Catherine's confidence wavered. I have my testimony, Ruth's testimony, the fact that Mother Superior never signed any debt contracts because St. Mary's owned no debts. But physical proof. She looked at Elijah. Do we have anything concrete? Elijah's expression went grim. I have the clearing where I found you, the wagon tracks, the bodies I left for animals to clean up. But 6 months of weather will have destroyed most evidence. It's your word against his papers. The reality settled over them like a shroud. Morrison had spent months building his legal trap, forging documents that looked official enough to fool a marshal, bribing or deceiving enough people to create witness corroboration. They were walking into a courtroom with truth as their only weapon against an enemy who had weaponized law itself. Then truth will have to be enough, Catherine said firmly, because I won't let Morrison win by making me too afraid to fight. They crossed the street together. The courthouse steps felt like climbing toward judgment, each stone riser bringing them closer to a moment that would determine whether Catherine remained free or became legally bound to the man who had trafficked her. Through the heavy oak doors, down a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced judges from Colorado Territory's brief history, into a courtroom already half filled with spectators drawn by the scandalous nature of the case. Jake Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table flanked by a lawyer whose expensive suit and calculating eyes marked him as someone comfortable, arguing morally bankrupt positions for the right price. Morrison's face still bore the scars Catherine's fingernails had carved. His damaged shoulder sat lower than the right, a permanent reminder of Elijah's bullet. When his gaze found Catherine, his smile carried the cold satisfaction of a predator confident in his trap. Marshal Thomas Garrett occupied a seat near the front, his weathered face unreadable. The past 3 days had given him time to investigate Morrison's claims. Whether that investigation had revealed truth or simply reinforced the lies was impossible to determine from his expression. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Harold Brennan entered from his chambers, a thin man in his 50s, whose gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles gave him the appearance of a university professor rather than a frontier jurist. He surveyed the courtroom with the detached interest of someone evaluating evidence rather than people. This is a civil hearing regarding the custody and legal status of one Catherine Morgan, formerly known as Sister Catherine Morgan of St. Mary's Convent. Brennan's voice carried the flat precision of someone who had presided over hundreds of similar proceedings. Mr. Morrison, you may present your claim. Morrison's lawyer stood shuffling papers with practiced efficiency. Your Honor, my client represents business interests that provided significant financial assistance to St. Mary's Convent over several years. When the convent proved unable to repay these debts, a legal agreement was reached whereby 4 sisters, including Miss Catherine Morgan, would provide labor services in compensation. My client has documentation establishing both the debt and the recovery agreement. He produced papers with a flourish. Contracts bearing the seal of St. Mary's Convent. Signatures that looked official to untrained eyes. Witness statements from men claiming to have been present when the agreements were finalized. A legal framework that transformed trafficking into debt collection. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, Miss Morgan was removed from Mr. Morrison's custody by one Elijah Stone, a known violent criminal with a history of killing. We have evidence suggesting Miss Morgan has been held against her will in isolated mountain conditions, possibly subjected to coercion or worse. My client seeks only to recover his legal property and ensure Miss Morgan receives appropriate care under proper church supervision. Catherine's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. The audacity of calling her property, of suggesting Elijah had coerced her when Morrison had beaten her badly enough to crack ribs, made rage sing through her veins. But she forced herself to remain silent. Emotional outbursts would only reinforce Morrison's narrative of a confused woman unable to think clearly. Judge Brennan examined the documents with careful attention. These appear properly executed and notarized. Miss Morgan, do you contest the validity of these contracts? Catherine stood grateful when her voice emerged steady despite her racing heart. Yes, Your Honor. Those documents are complete fabrications. St. Mary's Convent owed no debts. Mother Superior Abigail never signed any recovery agreement. Mr. Morrison trafficked me and 3 other women with the intent to sell us to mining camps and saloons. He beat Mother Superior unconscious during the raid. His claim of legal debt collection is a lie designed to give slavery a veneer of legitimacy. Morrison's lawyer immediately objected. Your Honor, Miss Morgan has been isolated for months with a dangerous man. Her judgment is clearly compromised. We request that her testimony be given minimal weight given the circumstances of potential coercion. I'll determine what weight to give testimony, Brennan said sharply. Miss Morgan, can you provide evidence contradicting these documents? I can provide my testimony, Your Honor, and the testimony of others who witnessed Mr. Morrison's trafficking operation. I can show you the scars from the beating his men gave me when I tried to escape. I can explain in detail how he planned to sell us like cattle, but physical evidence was destroyed when his operation was disrupted. By Mr. Stone's violent interference, the lawyer interjected smoothly, which conveniently eliminated witnesses who might contradict Miss Morgan's version of events. Catherine felt the trap closing. Without Mother Superior to testify, without physical evidence, without anything but her word against Morrison's papers, the judge might rule based purely on documentation. And documentation favored the man who had spent months constructing legal cover for his crimes. Then Father Benedict stood. Your Honor, if I may. Brennan's eyebrows rose. You are Father Benedict Walsh, assigned by the diocese to investigate the raid on St. Mary's Convent. I have testimony relevant to this proceeding. Proceed. Benedict moved to the witness area with quiet dignity. Your Honor, I have spoken directly with Mother Superior Abigail, who has recovered sufficiently from her injuries to provide a statement. She confirms that St. Mary's Convent held no debts and signed no recovery agreements. The documents Mr. Morrison presents are forgeries. Furthermore, Mother Superior describes in detail how Mr. Morrison's men attacked the convent, struck her unconscious, and abducted 4 women by force. He produced a letter bearing Mother Superior's signature and the official seal of the diocese. This sworn statement contradicts every element of Mr. Morrison's claim. I submit it as evidence that the contracts in question are fraudulent. Morrison's lawyer moved quickly to object. Hearsay, Your Honor. The witness is not present to be cross-examined. The statement is notarized and sworn, Benedict countered. Mother Superior remains too injured to travel, but her testimony is legally binding. Brennan examined the letter carefully. Catherine watched his expression shift subtly as he read Mother Superior's account of the raid. The violence, the explicit statements Morrison's men had made about selling the sisters, the complete absence of any debt or recovery agreement. This is compelling, Brennan said slowly. Mr. Morrison, your lawyer will have opportunity to respond. But first, I want to hear from other witnesses. Marshal Garrett, you investigated Mr. Morrison's claims. What did you find? Garrett stood reluctantly. Catherine could see the conflict in his weathered features. He had accepted Morrison's money, but confronted now with contradictory evidence, his conscience was clearly warring with his corruption. I found documentation that appeared legitimate, Garrett said carefully, But I also observed that Miss Morgan showed no signs of coercion when I encountered her at Mr. Stone's cabin. She was armed, articulate, and clearly capable of independent judgment. Furthermore, when I questioned Mr. Morrison's urgency in recovering her, he made statements suggesting financial payment, rather than legal obligation, motivated his actions. Morrison's face flushed red. His lawyer started to interrupt, but Garrett continued. I believe I was deceived, Your Honor. The more I've investigated since our confrontation 3 days ago, the more Mr. Morrison's story has fallen apart. I formally withdraw my enforcement of the warrant and recommend this court investigate whether criminal charges were warranted. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Catherine felt hope kindle for the first time since entering the building. A federal marshal admitting he had been fooled, potentially bribed, carried significant weight. Brennan would have to take that seriously. Order, Brennan commanded, his gavel cracking against the bench. Marshal Garrett, you're stating for the record that you believe Mr. Morrison's documentation is fraudulent. Yes, Your Honor, and I believe Miss Morgan's account of trafficking is accurate. Morrison's lawyer scrambled to recover. Your Honor, the marshal was clearly influenced by Mr. Stone's violent reputation. He admits he encountered Miss Morgan in Stone's custody under circumstances that strongly suggest coercion. A trained killer holding a young woman in isolated mountain conditions for months is hardly a situation conducive to free choice. We maintain that Miss Morgan has been compromised and should be removed to proper church supervision for her own protection. I'm not church property, Catherine said loudly, standing again despite protocol. Father Benedict has documentation proving I have been released from my vows. I have full legal standing to make my own decisions. Every head in the courtroom swiveled toward her. Morrison's confident expression cracked slightly. His lawyer looked genuinely shocked. Even Judge Brennan leaned forward with sudden interest. You've been released from religious vows, Brennan asked. When did this occur? Father Benedict stood again. Yesterday, Your Honor. I was empowered by the diocese to grant preliminary release pending full canonical review. Miss Morgan is no longer Sister Catherine. She has been freed from vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The Church makes no claim of custody or supervision over her. She is a private citizen with full rights to self-determination. He produced the release documents, handing them to the bailiff, who passed them to Brennan. Catherine watched the judge read carefully, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to something approaching respect. These appear legitimate and properly executed, Brennan said. Mr. Morrison, your entire argument rests on Miss Morgan being church property requiring supervision. If she's been released from religious life, that argument collapses entirely. Morrison's lawyer tried desperately to salvage the situation. The debt contracts predate her release, Your Honor. They establish Mr. Morrison's claim based on convent obligations, not Miss Morgan's religious status. The debt must still be satisfied regardless of her current circumstances. Except the debt never existed, Catherine said, her voice ringing with conviction. Those contracts are forgeries designed to give trafficking legal cover. Mr. Morrison beat Mother Superior, unconscious, abducted 4 women by force, and planned to sell us to men who would have destroyed us. Every word of his legal claim is a lie. You have no proof, Morrison shouted, finally losing his composure. Just your word against official documents. This court should enforce legal contracts, not listen to some confused woman who spread her legs for a mountain savage. The crude accusation hung in shocked silence. Elijah surged to his feet, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. Catherine grabbed his arm, holding him back, despite wanting to let him loose on Morrison's smug face. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Mr. Morrison, you will control yourself or be removed from this courtroom. That kind of language has no place in legal proceedings. But the outburst had revealed the monster beneath Morrison's civilized veneer. The courtroom spectators murmured with clear disapproval. Even Morrison's own lawyer looked horrified at his client's lack of restraint. Brennan studied Morrison with new coldness. I'm beginning to share Marshal Garrett's skepticism about your claims. But before I rule, I want to hear from other witnesses. Is Sister Ruth present? A quiet voice from the back of the courtroom answered, I'm here, Your Honor. Ruth moved forward slowly, each step carrying a visible courage. 6 months had not erased the trauma in her eyes, but they also held fierce determination. She had traveled from the Patterson mission specifically to testify, knowing it would require reliving the worst moments of her life. Catherine's throat tightened with pride and grief, watching her friend take the witness stand. "State your name for the record," Brennan said gently, his tone softening in recognition of Ruth's obvious distress. "Ruth Fletcher, formerly Sister Ruth of St. Mary's Convent. You were present during the events in question." "Yes, Your Honor, I was one of the 4 women Mr. Morrison abducted." Ruth's hands twisted together in her lap, but her voice remained steady. "He and his men attacked our convent during evening prayers. They struck Mother Superior so hard she fell bleeding to the chapel floor. They bound us and loaded us into a wagon like cargo. For 3 days, they transported us through the mountains, making clear we would be sold to mining camps for the sexual use of minors." Morrison's lawyer tried to object, but Brennan waved him to silence. "Continue, Miss Fletcher." Ruth's voice dropped, each word clearly costing her. "On the second night after Catherine tried to escape and was beaten, Morrison's men decided to provide a demonstration of what awaited us at our destination. They dragged me from the wagon. 3 of them held me down while a 4th," her voice broke, "while he violated me. Morrison watched, said it would make me more compliant when we reached the camps, said broken women fetched lower prices but caused less trouble." The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Catherine saw several spectators with tears streaming down their faces. The horror of what Ruth described hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable. "I fought," Ruth continued, "but they were stronger. When they finished, Morrison told me that if Catherine tried to escape again, they would do worse, use me to punish her resistance. So I begged Catherine not to run, told her to endure whatever came because I couldn't survive another assault." She looked directly at Morrison for the first time. "You did that, not as debt collection, not as legal recovery. You did it because you're a monster who sees women as property to be broken and sold. And I will testify to that truth in every court in this territory until you pay for what you did to me and countless others." Morrison's face had gone pale. His lawyer frantically scribbled notes, clearly calculating whether his client had any defense against such devastating testimony. Around the courtroom, Catherine saw the shift in public opinion. Whatever sympathy Morrison's legal arguments might have generated evaporated in the face of Ruth's raw honesty. Judge Brennan's expression had transformed from judicial neutrality to barely contained rage. "Mr. Morrison, do you have any response to this testimony?" Morrison's lawyer stood on shaking legs. "Your Honor, this is clearly the result of trauma-induced confusion. Miss Fletcher has conflated separate events. My client denies any involvement in assault. These are serious accusations that require more evidence than emotionally compromised testimony." "I have evidence," Ruth said quietly. "The doctor at the Patterson Mission documented my injuries. I have scars that match my description of the assault. And I'm not the only one. Mr. Morrison has been trafficking women for years. If this court investigates, you'll find dozens of victims with similar stories." Brennan turned to Marshall Garrett. "Marshall, I want you to open a criminal investigation immediately. Interview every woman who can be connected to Mr. Morrison's activities. Document everything." "Yes, Your Honor." "Furthermore, I am suspending these proceedings pending that investigation. Mr. Morrison, you will surrender your weapons and remain in Denver under Marshall Garrett's supervision until criminal charges can be properly evaluated." Morrison exploded from his seat. "This is a farce. I have legal documentation. You can't just ignore contracts because some whore tells a sob story." The gavel cracked again. "Mr. Morrison, you are in contempt. Bailiff, place him in custody immediately." 2 deputies moved to restrain Morrison. He struggled, screaming about corruption and injustice, but they subdued him with professional efficiency. As they dragged him toward the door, his wild eyes found Catherine's. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You're mine. Those papers prove it." Catherine stood, her voice cutting through his rage. "Your papers are lies, and I belong to no one but myself." Morrison's struggles intensified, but the deputies hauled him from the courtroom. The doors slammed shut, muffling his continued shouting. In the sudden quiet, Catherine realized she was shaking. Elijah's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing gently. Judge Brennan surveyed the courtroom. "This hearing is adjourned pending criminal investigation. However, I am prepared to rule on the immediate custody question." Miss Morgan approached the bench. Catherine stood on trembling legs. Elijah rose with her, his presence solid and reassuring. They faced Brennan together. Miss Morgan, I have heard compelling testimony suggesting Mr. Morrison's claims are fraudulent, Brennan said. I have documentation showing you have been released from religious vows and possess full legal standing. I have a federal marshal admitting he was likely deceived, and I have witnessed Mr. Morrison's complete lack of self-control and decorum. Based on all of this, I find no grounds to grant his petition for custody. Relief crashed through Catherine so intensely she swayed. Elijah's arm came around her waist, holding her upright. Furthermore, Brennan continued, I find that the contracts presented are likely forgeries created to provide legal cover for trafficking. I am ordering them seized as evidence in the criminal investigation. Miss Morgan, you are free from any claim Mr. Morrison has attempted to establish. You may go where you choose and with whom you choose. This court recognizes your full autonomy and legal standing as a private citizen. Thank you, Your Honor. Catherine managed through tears. Brennan's severe expression softened slightly. Mr. Stone, I assume you intend to marry Miss Morgan. Elijah straightened. Yes, Your Honor, if she'll have me. Then I suggest you do so quickly and properly. Frontier society has a little tolerance for unmarried cohabitation, regardless of the circumstances that preceded it. Father Benedict Vister's trust you'll perform the ceremony. Benedict smiled. It would be my honor, Your Honor. Good. This hearing is concluded. Marshal Garrett, ensure Mr. Morrison remains in custody. I want a full investigation within 30 days. The gavel fell one final time. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in conversation. Spectators surged forward to congratulate Catherine and Ruth. Strangers who had witnessed the hearing wanted to shake their hands to express support to assure them that justice had prevailed. But Catherine only had eyes for Elijah, this man who had killed to save her, who had kept her alive through a blizzard that should have claimed them both, who had loved her enough to offer freedom rather than demanding she stay. She pulled him close, not caring about propriety or public opinion. We won, she whispered against his chest. You won, Elijah corrected. Your courage, your refusal to let Morrison make you afraid. All I did was shoot people. You did more than that. Catherine pulled back enough to meet his pale blue eyes. You showed me I was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth loving, that I had value beyond what institutions or men like Morrison tried to claim I possessed. Elijah's calloused hand cupped her face with infinite tenderness. I love you, Catherine Morgan. Will you marry me properly, officially, in front of God and whatever witnesses Father Benedict can gather? Yes, today if possible. I don't want to wait another moment. Father Benedict approached his stern expression, cracking into an actual smile. I can perform the ceremony this afternoon if you'd like. There's a small chapel 2 streets over. Very simple, but it has a lovely view of the mountains. Perfect, Catherine said. But before the wedding, there was one final ritual to complete. Catherine turned to find Marshal Garrett hovering uncertainly near the back of the courtroom. She approached him directly, Elijah a half step behind her. Marshal Garrett, Catherine said formally, you admitted you were deceived. That took courage. Garrett's weathered face flushed. I took money from Morrison. Not much, but enough that I didn't ask the questions I should have. I'm sorry, Miss Morgan. You deserve better from the law. You're making it right now. That's what matters. Catherine paused, then added, I need those forged contracts. The ones Morrison claimed gave him ownership of me. Garrett frowned. They're evidence in the criminal case. I can't just hand them over. I don't want to keep them. I want to destroy them, publicly, so everyone understands that no piece of paper can claim to own a human being. Understanding dawned in Garrett's expression. He glanced toward Judge Brennan, who had been listening. The judge gave a small nod. The court has concluded its business with those documents, Brennan said. If Miss Morgan wishes to dispose of them symbolically, I have no objection. Garrett retrieved the papers from the evidence table. Catherine accepted them, feeling their weight. Pages of lies, forged signatures, fake seals, legal language that transformed trafficking into debt collection. Morrison had spent months constructing this elaborate fiction. She was about to reduce it to ash in minutes. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Word of the hearing's outcome had spread through Denver's streets with the speed only scandal could achieve. Catherine found herself surrounded by curious faces, some sympathetic, some scandalized, all intensely interested in what would happen next. She held up the documents. These papers claimed to establish Jake Morrison's legal ownership of me and three other women. They're complete fabrications, forged contracts designed to make slavery look legitimate. Her voice carried across the crowd. Elijah stood beside her, solid and protective. Father Benedict watched with approval. Ruth joined them, standing witness to the destruction of the lies that had nearly destroyed them both. But slavery is illegal, Catherine continued. Human beings cannot be owned. Not by debt, not by religion, not by any institution or individual. We belong only to ourselves and to those we freely choose. She pulled out the flint Elijah had taught her to use during their mountain isolation. Struck a spark. The papers caught immediately, flames spreading with hungry eagerness across the forged words. Catherine held them high, letting everyone see the fire consume Morrison's elaborate legal trap. Elijah stepped beside her, adding his hand to hers on the burning papers. Together, they held the flames as heat licked toward their fingers. The symbolism was unmistakable. Two people choosing to face danger together, choosing to burn away the past and embrace an uncertain future. These lies claimed I owed Morrison labor money obedience, Catherine said as the papers crumbled. But I owe nothing except what I choose to give. I choose Elijah Stone. I choose freedom. I choose a life built on truth instead of pretty lies. The final fragments turned to ash. The wind caught them, scattering the remains across Denver's streets. In minutes, no trace remained of the documents Morrison had spent months forging. They had existed. They had threatened. Now they were less than memory. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered. Some looked scandalized that a former nun would so publicly choose a man over religious life. But most simply watched with the fascination of witnessing something unprecedented. A woman literally burning the chains that had been used to bind her. Morrison, being led to the town jail in shackles, saw the smoke rising from his forged contracts. His scream of rage carried clearly across the distance. Catherine turned to look at him directly, holding his gaze until he looked away first. The dynamic had reversed completely. He was the one in chains now. She was free. Ruth embraced Catherine tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for fighting, for showing me it's possible to choose yourself instead of accepting what others decide you should be." "What will you do?" Catherine asked. "Will you seek release from your vows too?" Ruth nodded. "Father Benedict has agreed to help me petition. I'm not ready for what comes after yet, but I know I can't go back to pretending the calling was real when it was just fear wearing religious disguise." They held each other, two women who had survived trafficking and trauma, who had found the courage to choose new paths despite society's disapproval. Then Ruth stepped back, managed a smile, and moved toward where the Patterson family waited to take her back to their mission. Elijah touched Catherine's shoulder gently. "Ready. For what? To become my wife. Officially, legally, in front of witnesses who can't claim later we did anything improper." Catherine laughed, the sound bright with relief and joy, and the sheer impossibility of how this day had transformed. "Absolutely. Let's go find Father Benedict and make this permanent." The chapel Father Benedict had mentioned was indeed simple. Wooden pews worn smooth by decades of use, a plain altar with a single cross, windows that framed views of mountains rising in purple majesty against the afternoon sky. No flowers or decorations, or any of the elaborate trappings Catherine had once imagined for her wedding day. But it was perfect. Word had spread about the hearing and the public burning. When Catherine entered the chapel an hour later, she found it packed with unexpected witnesses, townspeople who had attended the trial, women from Denver's respectable society who had heard about Catherine's stand against Morrison and wanted to show support. Even a few miners, rough men who appreciated a good fight regardless of whether it happened in a courtroom or a saloon. Ruth stood near the altar, having insisted on witnessing the ceremony before returning to the Patterson mission. Marshal Garrett occupied a pew near the back, his presence a silent acknowledgement that the law could sometimes serve justice instead of just power. Catherine wore the same simple blue dress she had worn that morning. No wedding gown, no veil, just practical fabric that had served her through months of mountain living. Elijah had found a clean shirt, though he still wore his worn buckskin jacket and the ever-present knife at his belt. They looked like exactly what they were, two people forged by hardship into something stronger than either had been alone. Father Benedict stood before the altar in full vestments, his stern face transformed by genuine warmth. "Dearly beloved," he began, then paused. "Actually, given the unusual circumstances, I think we can dispense with the traditional preamble. Catherine and Elijah, you've chosen each other despite every obstacle society and circumstance could manufacture. You've proven your commitment through trials that would have destroyed lesser bonds. So let's simply formalize what's already true." He looked at Elijah. "Elijah Stone, do you take Catherine Morgan as your lawfully wedded wife, to love and protect, to honor and cherish, to stand beside through whatever joys and sorrows come?" "I do." Elijah's voice carried absolute certainty, no hesitation, no doubt. Just the same unwavering commitment he applied to everything from tracking deer to defending the helpless. "And Catherine Morgan, do you take Elijah Stone as your lawfully wedded husband, to love and support, to honor and cherish, to stand beside through whatever joys and sorrows come?" Catherine's throat tightened with emotion, but her voice emerged clear and strong. "I do. I believe in traditional vows," Father Benedict said with gentle humor, "but I also believe in vows that fit the people speaking them. So I'll ask you both to make one additional promise. Catherine, Elijah, do you vow to protect each other's freedom as fiercely as you protect each other's lives, to never use your bond as a chain, but always as a shelter?" "I do," they said together. Father Benedict smiled. "Then by the power vested in me by the Catholic Church in the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. Elijah, you may kiss your bride." Elijah pulled Catherine close, his kiss tender, despite the passion burning beneath careful control. When they broke apart, the chapel erupted in applause. Strangers cheering for two people they barely knew, celebrating a love story that had begun in violence and bloomed in unlikely soil. As they walked back down the aisle together, Catherine felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of vows made too young had lifted. The shadow of Morrison's threat had vanished. She was simply Catherine Stone, now married to a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than property. Outside the chapel, they found an unexpected sight. Someone had organized an impromptu celebration. Tables laden with food that townspeople had contributed. A musician with a fiddle, ready playing cheerful mountain tunes. Denver's citizens, many of whom probably disapproved of Catherine's choices on principle, had decided that a good wedding deserved proper celebration, regardless of scandal. Elijah pulled Catherine close as the fiddle music swelled. "Dance with me." "I don't know mountain dances." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." They moved together clumsily, laughing at missed steps and collisions. Around them, others joined the dancing. Ruth partnered with a young rancher who had attended the trial. Marshall Garrett surprised everyone by dancing with the town schoolteacher. Even Father Benedict allowed himself to be coaxed into a sedate waltz with Denver's mayor's wife. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Catherine rested her head against Elijah's chest and listened to his heartbeat. This morning she had faced a courtroom that might have ruled she belonged to a trafficker. Now she stood married to the man she loved, surrounded by unexpected community, with freedom, documented and celebrated. "No regrets?" Elijah asked softly. "None, you. Just that I wasted 8 years alone when I could have been looking for you." Catherine smiled. "We found each other when we needed to. That's enough." They stayed in Denver one more night in a boarding house that rented them a room with slightly scandalized reluctance, despite Father Benedict's assurance that they were properly married. The next morning they prepared for the journey back to the mountains. Ruth approached as they readied their horses. "Write to me," she asked Catherine. "Let me know how mountain life treats you. I want to believe it's possible to build something good after surviving something terrible." "It's possible," Catherine assured her. "Hard, but possible. And I'll write. You're my sister Ruth. Blood couldn't make us closer than what we survived together." They embraced one final time. Then Elijah helped Catherine mount, and they turned their horses toward home. The trail climbed steadily, leaving Denver's noise and judgment behind. With each mile, Catherine felt the civilized world falling away. The mountains accepted them without question, indifferent to scandal or social convention. 5 years passed. The cabin Elijah had once inhabited alone had grown into something approaching a homestead. An additional room provided space for the children. A barn housed animals acquired through trade and careful husbandry. The garden Catherine had started in their first spring together had expanded into terraced plots, that provided vegetables through most of the year. Catherine Stone, now 29, stood in that garden on a June morning. Her hands were dirty from planting. Her hair, no longer confined by a nun's veil, hung in a practical braid down her back. Scars marked her wrists from Morrison's ropes, permanent reminders of where she had come from. But her eyes held peace that had been absent in her convent days. Inside the cabin, she heard children's voices raised in argument. Samuel and Grace, the orphans she and Elijah had adopted after cholera, swept through a nearby settlement 3 years ago, were fighting over whose turn it was to gather eggs. Catherine smiled. Normal childhood conflicts felt like blessings after the silence of their first years together. Elijah emerged from the woods carrying a deer across his shoulders. At 40, his dark hair showed streaks of gray. Lines creased the corners of his eyes from squinting into mountain sun. But he moved with the same efficiency that had characterized him when they first met. Time had gentled him without diminishing his capability. "Good hunt," Catherine called. "Good enough. Should see us through the week." Elijah set down his burden and crossed to kiss his wife, a casual intimacy they had built over 5 years of learning each other's rhythms. Samuel asked if he could come next time. "Thinks he's ready to track." Maybe. Kid's patient, which is half the skill. I'll take him out this week, see how he handles himself." They worked together to process the deer, their movements coordinated through long practice. Samuel and Grace eventually emerged their dispute, forgotten, eager to help with tasks that had become familiar through repetition. Catherine watched Grace carefully gut and clean portions of meat under Elijah's patient instruction. The girl, now 7, showed the same fearlessness Catherine had once possessed. Elijah treated her exactly as he treated Samuel, teaching both children survival skills without gender distinction. It was one of the 1,000 ways he showed Catherine he meant his vows about partnership and equality. Later, after the children were in bed, Catherine and Elijah sat outside watching stars emerge over the peaks. This had become their evening ritual. Time to talk about the day plan for tomorrow, simply exist together in comfortable quiet. "Letter came from Ruth today," Catherine said. "She's getting married. To that rancher she danced with at our wedding. Found someone who doesn't care that she was trafficked, who sees her strength instead of her damage. Good for her. She deserves happiness. She asked if we'd come to the wedding. It's in Denver next month." Elijah tensed slightly. He still disliked civilization, still preferred mountain isolation to society's judgment. But he had learned to endure it for Catherine's sake. "We can go if you want. Leave the kids with the Patterson family for a few days." "I want," Catherine confirmed. "Ruth stood by me when it mattered most. I want to stand by her when she chooses her future." "Then we'll go." Silence settled between them. The kind of comfortable quiet that only came from years of trust. Catherine thought about the girl she had been at 19 fleeing into the convent because she didn't know how to face her father's remarriage. That girl had been running from pain instead of toward purpose, had been afraid of choice, of freedom, of the responsibility that came with self-determination. The woman she had become embraced all those things. She had chosen Elijah, chosen the mountain, chosen a life that society might view as lesser, but which gave her everything she actually needed: partnership, respect, the freedom to be herself instead of trying to fit someone else's definition of womanhood or holiness or worth. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. The question they had asked each other countless times over 5 years, always receiving the same answer, but needing the reassurance of hearing it again. "Never," Elijah said firmly. "This life exceeded anything I could have imagined. Even without biological children, we built a family. You became the finest healer in 3 counties. I learned to read well enough to enjoy philosophy. We created something real, Catherine. Something honest." Father Benedict wrote too, said he's proud of us, that we taught him sometimes God's will looks like breaking rules instead of following them. Elijah smiled. Wise priest, that one. Catherine leaned against her husband, his arm coming around her naturally. They sat like that, a darkness deepened, 2 people who had found each other through violence and built something beautiful from the ashes of trauma. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Winter would come again, as brutal as ever. The children would grow and face their own struggles. Life would be hard in ways both familiar and unexpected, but they would face everything together, as equals, as partners, as 2 people who had learned that freedom was not the absence of commitment, but the presence of choice. They had chosen each other, were still choosing each other, would continue choosing each other through whatever years remained. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and snow from higher elevations. It whispered through the trees like a blessing, like a promise, like the voice of something larger than human institutions, acknowledging that love built on truth would always outlast lies constructed from power. Catherine closed her eyes and listened to Elijah's heartbeat. Steady, strong, the sound that had kept her alive through a blizzard. The rhythm that had become as familiar as her own pulse. She was home, not in a place but in a choice. The choice to love this complicated, damaged, honorable man. The choice to build a life that defied easy categorization. The choice to burn away everything false and embrace what remained, however imperfect. Jake Morrison had died in prison, 2 years into his sentence, killed by another inmate who learned what he had done to women. Catherine had felt only relief at the news. One less predator in a world that manufactured them too efficiently. Mother Superior Abigail had recovered and continued leading St. Mary's Convent, though she had written to Catherine expressing understanding and support for her choice. The church had formally released Catherine's vows and acknowledging that trauma and youth had invalidated her original commitment, and Catherine had become simply herself. Not Sister Catherine Morgan bound by vows made too young, not Catherine the victim of trafficking. Just Catherine Stone, wife and mother and healer and woman who had claimed her own life from those who tried to define it for her. Elijah's hand found hers in the darkness. Their fingers intertwined, a gesture as familiar now as breathing. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For choosing me, for staying, for building this with me even when easier paths existed." "There were no easier paths," Catherine replied with absolute certainty. "Just different ones. And this is the only one I wanted to walk." Inside the cabin, Samuel called out from a nightmare. Catherine started to rise, but Elijah was already moving. She heard him speaking softly to the boy, the same gentle patience he showed when teaching tracking or explaining why animals behave certain ways. The child's cries quieted as Elijah's calm presence reassured him that the dark held no threats here. When Elijah returned, Catherine pulled him close. "You're a good father. I'm a work in progress, but I'm trying. That's all any of us can do. Try, choose, build something better than what we inherited." They stayed outside until the cold drove them in, until the fire needed tending and morning preparations beckoned, until sleep claimed them in the bed they had shared for 5 years, wrapped in each other's warmth against the mountain cold. Catherine's last waking thought, as it was most nights, was gratitude. For Elijah's rifle shot that had ended Morrison's immediate threat. For Father Benedict's willingness to bend rules in service of truth. For Ruth's courage in testifying. For her own determination to fight rather than submit. But most of all, for the moment Elijah had burned those papers claiming ownership of her soul. The moment freedom had transformed from abstract concept to literal truth, ashes scattering on the wind, carrying lies away, and leaving only choice behind. She belonged to no one but herself, and she had chosen to belong with Elijah Stone. The distinction mattered more than any document could express. In the morning, life would continue. Simple, hard, beautiful in its honesty. Exactly what Catherine had needed all along without knowing how to name it. She slept in her husband's arms, surrounded by children they had chosen to love, sheltered by mountains that asked nothing except respect for their power. Free at last from every chain except those she had voluntarily taken on. And that freedom fought for and won and defended was worth every sacrifice. The mountain winds sang through the pines. The fire crackled into the hearth. Two hearts beat in rhythm, synchronized through years of choosing each other. This was home. This was love. This was the life Catherine Morgan Stone had claimed when she burned the papers and chose truth over pretty lies. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.